Let's interpret the standard deviation of a data set. Now, standard deviation talks about how far the data values are from the mean, right? We're talking about the spread. Whereas if we have a large standard deviation, we have a large spread, which may mean a large range. So think about your max and your min. The bigger the range, probably the bigger the standard deviation. Same thing if we have a small standard deviation, we have a small spread, which means we probably have a smaller range. Okay, so let's jump in. When we talk about the number of standard deviations from the mean, we're talking about the data value that's in question, we subtract the mean, and then we divide by the standard deviation. This right here is sometimes called a z-score. And so the formula sometimes looks, or always looks, like z equals x minus mu over sigma. So data value minus the mean over the standard deviation. And that tells us how many standard deviations we are from the mean. So the smaller the value of z, the closer the value is to the mean. The larger the z, the farther away it is from the mean. So let's look at some of these. The mean on the last test was an 82 with a standard deviation of 4. If you scored a 76, describe your score using the standard deviation. Okay, so I often find it easier to actually write down what you know. So the mean was an 82. The standard deviation was 4. You scored a 76. That's the data value. So if you want to talk about this, we can say, okay, well, I know that the z-score is x minus the mean over the standard deviation. So data value minus the mean, 76 minus 82 over 4, which gives me a negative 6 over 4, which is negative 1.5. Now, because this is, think about a number line. If 0 is the mean, negative 1.5 is right here. So, and this is where you are. So you are 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. And that should make sense because you know that 76 is less than an 82. You scored below the mean, and you scored 1.5 standard deviations below. Now, in part B, your best friend scored an 86. So what does this mean? Well, if x is 86, we still have the same mean of 82 and a standard deviation of 4. So 86 minus 82 over 4 means we have 4 over 4, which is 1. So your best friend scored 1 standard deviation above the mean, right? And it's above because it's positive. Again, 1 is over here, and this is where your best friend is. So that's 1 standard deviation above the mean. The math teacher had a mean of 74 with a standard deviation of 2.1. The biology teacher had an average of 79 with a standard deviation of 7.6. The biology teacher thinks their students did much better than the math students. What do you think? Well, let's just look at this in general. So if we're talking about math, we have an average of 74 and a standard deviation of 2.1. Biology had an average of 79 and a standard deviation of 7.6. So the biology teacher has a higher average, but look at the standard deviation. It's a lot bigger. That means the spread of data is a lot bigger. So what I like to do is I like to think about comparing a value. So I would say the math teacher actually did better. So let's just say if a student scored an 80, how does that work on each test? So if you think about it over here, 80 minus 74 over 2.1. So if I do that math, right, I get, forgot my decimal, 6 over 2.1. And this gives us just in general for that one. So if you scored an 80 on the math test, you scored 2.86 above the mean. Right, that's really good. If you scored an 80 on the biology test, 80 minus 79 over 7.6, that's 1 over 7.6, and you get 0.13 standard deviations above the mean, which means you're basically average. So an 80 on biology means you're barely above average, which is not a bad thing. But if you're an 80 on math, you are way above average. So it's one of those things of In biology, yes, you may have had a higher average, but because of how big your standard deviation is, your students have this super wide range. Means you have some students who did really well, but you have a ton of students who also did really poorly. Whereas in math, your average might be a little lower, but everybody is about the same. So the math teacher, I would say, is way more consistent, and it would help students feel a little better if they got an 80, because comparatively they did a lot better in math than they did in biology. Hope that made a little bit of sense.